Come in, close the door behind you, and let the rest of the house go quiet. Turn the light down low, just low enough that the corners of the room start to soften. Pull the blanket up over your shoulders, the way you did when you were small and someone else was in charge of tucking in the edges. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. You do not have to hold your head up for anyone tonight. Get all the way horizontal if you can. There is nowhere else you need to be. I want to tell you something first, before we go anywhere at all, because I think it will surprise you the way it surprised me. In 1925, in an average American town, a woman might spend more of her household's money in a single year than her husband did, not because she had more money, but because she was the one who decided, hour by hour, where nearly every dollar of the family income actually went. Economists at the time knew this. They wrote about it, quietly, in trade journals meant for advertisers, not for the women themselves. They called it the purchasing power of the American housewife, and they estimated that women controlled somewhere between 80 and 90% of consumer spending in the United States by the middle of the decade. 80 to 90%. Read that again if you need to. The men earned the wages in most households, but the women decided what those wages became, what food arrived on the table, what fabric became a Sunday dress, what particular tin of talcum powder sat on a particular shelf in a particular bathroom for a particular reason that only she fully understood. Tonight, I want to sit with that fact for a long time. Not the version of the 1920s you have already seen. The flappers, the raised hemlines, the sense of a decade shaking loose from its corset, if you'll forgive me the pun. That version isn't wrong exactly, but it's incomplete in a way that erases almost everyone. Tonight I want to tell you what women actually spent their money on, and why, and what it cost them to know how to spend it well, because knowing how to spend money well, truly well, under real constraint, with real consequences, was one of the most demanding forms of expertise a person could hold in that decade. Nobody called it expertise. That's part of what we're going to talk about. Let us go somewhere specific. Not a general idea of the 20s, but one particular kitchen on one particular morning, so your mind has somewhere real to rest while I talk. It is early April 1925, somewhere in the middle of the country. The exact town doesn't quite matter, though. If it helps you to picture it, think of a place with a courthouse square, two churches within sight of each other, a 5 and dime with a green awning and a rail line that still matters more than anyone likes to admit. The light at 6:15 in the morning is the particular gray gold of early spring, not quite committed to warmth yet. Coming in low through a kitchen window that has been wiped down with vinegar water so many times, the glass has a faint permanent cloudiness near the bottom corner, right where a small hand once pressed against it during a long illness, 2 winters back. The kitchen smells like coal smoke from the stove, and underneath that, coffee, real coffee, ground fresh that morning, not the chicory-cut kind some households still use to stretch a can further than it wanted to go. There's a percolator on the stove making its slow, complicated sound, that rhythmic bubble and catch that would become, within a decade, the sound of a certain kind of American morning everywhere. I want you to notice, before we go any further, that I've already given you 3 small economic facts without calling them that. Real coffee versus chicory-cut coffee. A kitchen window cleaned with vinegar because store-bought glass cleaner was a small extravagance not every household chose to make. A stove that burns coal, not gas, because gas lines hadn't reached every street yet. And the difference between those 2 kitchens, the coal kitchen and the gas kitchen, was itself a quiet marker of where a family stood. This is how it works, this decade. The smallest details are never just details. They are always underneath a record of a decision, and a decision is always underneath that a record of a constraint. Let's call the woman standing at that stove Ruth. It's a good common name for the era, the kind of name that belonged to a school teacher's daughter or a farmer's daughter or a shopkeeper's daughter with more or less equal ease, which is exactly why I've chosen it. Ruth is not a real person. I want to be honest with you about that. From the start. She is built from research, from ledgers and diaries and home economics bulletins and oral histories collected decades later from women who were young wives in exactly this period. Women who remembered with startling precision the price of a pound of butter in 1925, even when they had forgotten a great deal else. Ruth is a composite. But everything about her, her habits, her worries, the particular arithmetic she carries in her head without writing it down, is drawn from lives that were actually lived. Ruth is 29 years old. She was married at 22 to a man named Walter who works as a bookkeeper for a hardware wholesaler, 2 streets over, a job that pays him $1,100 a year, which puts them solidly unremarkably in the middle of things. Not poor, never in danger of hunger, but never for one single week free from the discipline of a fixed and finite sum. They have 2 children. Frances is 7, sharp-eyed, already reading above her grade, with a habit of asking questions at dinner that make Walter laugh and Ruth go quiet in a way she doesn't examine too closely. Tommy is 4, still round in the face, still willing to be carried, though not for much longer. Look at Ruth's hands for a moment. This is where I always like to start with a person, because hands tell you things faces are taught to hide. Her hands are not soft. There is a particular roughness across the knuckles that comes from lye soap and cold water, because in April hot water for washing is not something you run casually from a tap. It is something you build, kettle by kettle, on a stove that is also cooking breakfast. And there is a calculation behind every kettle, an unspoken sum of coal against comfort. Her nails are cut short and practical, no polish, because polish was still in 1925 associated in most respectable households with a kind of woman Ruth was not trying to resemble, though within 2 or 3 years that association would begin quietly to shift. There's a thin white scar across the base of her left thumb from a wringer washer 3 years back, the kind of small, permanent injury so common among women of her generation that it barely registered as a story worth telling. Her hair is put up each morning in a way that takes 11 minutes, not because she is vain about it, but because a woman with her hair correctly and modestly arranged is a woman who has silently passed a kind of daily inspection that nobody administers out loud, and everybody is nonetheless taking. Now, pull the blanket a little closer, because I want to walk you through Ruth's day, and through it I want to show you where the money actually goes, because this is the part that almost nobody talks about. Not the big purchases, the small ones made a dozen times a day that added up to the real shape of a household's economic life. Walter's pay comes on Friday in an envelope, in cash. This detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Most working households in this decade were paid in cash, not by check, and the handing over of that envelope was, in a great many marriages, a small ritual with enormous consequences buried inside it. In some households, the husband opened the envelope himself, doled out what he judged necessary for the week's groceries and expenses, and kept the rest, deciding on larger purchases, furniture, a victrola, a used automobile, without much consultation. In other households, and Ruth's is one of them, the entire envelope passed directly into the wife's hands, and it was she who divided it. So much for rent, so much for the iceman, so much for the grocer, so much set aside in a tin on the top shelf of the pantry that Walter did not open, and by unspoken agreement did not ask about. The second arrangement, the wife as household treasurer, was, by 1925, the more common one in America, and it is worth pausing on why, because the reason is not romantic. It is not that husbands trusted their wives out of some enlightened generosity. It is that household management had become, over the previous half-century, genuinely complicated enough that a man working 10 hours a day at a wholesale house simply did not have the time or the granular knowledge to do it well, and everyone involved knew it. Home economics as a discipline had spent 30 years professionalizing the management of a household budget, publishing bulletins, teaching classes at land-grant colleges, running columns in women's magazines that treated the allocation of a family's income with the seriousness of a business ledger, because that is in fact precisely what it was. I find myself thinking about this a great deal, that the single largest area of financial decision-making in most American families during this decade, larger in raw dollar terms across the whole economy than almost any single industry you could name, was managed almost entirely by women who were in the same breath described by the culture around them as economically unproductive. She doesn't work, people said, about women like Ruth. She managed in real terms several $1,000s a year in family resources, with a skill set that included nutrition, chemistry, textile knowledge, negotiation, timing, and an almost actuarial sense of risk. And the word used for this was doesn't. Let us stay with this for a moment, because I don't think it's a small thing. Ruth's Friday morning then. Walter leaves at 7:40 with his lunch pail. Cold ham, bread, an apple, wrapped in waxed paper that Ruth reuses 3 or 4 times before it's too creased to fold properly anymore. The moment the door closes, Ruth sits down at the kitchen table with the envelope, a pencil, and a small notebook with a marbled cover that cost a nickel at the 5 and dime, and that she has kept, in one form or another, since the 2nd year of her marriage. This notebook is where the actual economic life of the household lies, not in Walter's mind, not in any bank, since they don't have much of a relationship with a bank beyond a small savings account Ruth opened herself in her own name, a fact that was legally possible by this point, but socially unusual enough that the bank clerk had asked the first time whether her husband knew she was doing this. $1,100 a year comes to a little over $21 a week. Out of that $21, Ruth sets aside rent. They pay $18 a month for a modest 2-story frame house, which she divides mentally into a weekly figure of a little over $4, kept separate in an envelope of its own. She sets aside for the Iceman, who comes 3 times a week in warm weather with a great dripping block hauled by tongs into the icebox on the back porch, a service that costs 60 cents a week in season, a cost that will, within a handful of years, begin to be replaced by the electric refrigerator, though. In 1925, an electric refrigerator cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 to $300 more than Walter earns in 10 weeks, and so it remains for now a fact about the future, rather than the present. She sets aside for coal, for the small amounts of cash the children need for school, a penny here, 2 cents there for pencils and paper, and then what remains. And in a week like this one, after the fixed costs, what remains is somewhere between $9 and $11, is what Ruth has to work with for food, clothing, incidentals, and whatever she can manage to save. $9 to $11 to feed and partially clothe a family of 4 for a week in 1925. Let me give you a sense of what that actually bought, because I think the number means nothing until you can feel its weight in your hand. A pound of round steak cost about 32 cents. A dozen eggs in April, with hens laying well, might run 28 cents in December, with fewer eggs and more demand. The same dozen could cost 60 cents or more. And Ruth knew this rhythm the way a farmer knows weather, and she planned around it, buying and preserving eggs in a solution of water glass in the spring specifically so that the family would not feel the winter prices sharply. A pound of butter ran about 50 cents. A 5-pound sack of flour, 25 cents. A quart of milk, 10 to 12 cents, delivered fresh to the porch each morning by a boy on a bicycle whose route Ruth could set her clock by. Sugar, a pound for 8 cents. A loaf of bread from the bakery, a nickel, though Ruth, like most women of her income and inclination, still baked her own bread twice a week. Not because it was cheaper, it was marginally, but not enough to fully explain the choice, but because store bread was still in many households associated faintly with either poverty or laziness, and a woman's bread was one of the most visible, most judged products of her labor. Neighbors who came to borrow a cup of sugar noticed the bread on the counter. They noticed its rise, its crust, its crumb. Nothing was said directly. Everything was noted. This is the part that almost nobody talks about when they talk about the 1920s, the sheer cognitive load of running a household on this kind of tight, granular, ever-shifting arithmetic. Ruth was not simply spending money. She was running a small, continuous economic forecasting operation with incomplete information, punishing consequences for error, and absolutely no formal recognition that this was what she was doing. She knew which grocer extended credit graciously in a lean week, and which one did not. She knew that the butcher would set aside a good soup bone if she asked on Tuesday rather than Saturday when everyone else asked too. She knew from bitter experience 2 winters ago exactly how many days a barrel of flour would last if Tommy had croup and needed more bread pudding than usual, and she had adjusted her buying that year without a single word of complaint to anyone, because complaint was not a resource she had much use for. I want to be careful here because I don't want to make this sound grimmer than it was. It would be a mistake, and I think a fairly common one in how this era gets told, to make Ruth's life sound like nothing but hardship and calculation. That's not true, and it flattens her. She took real, unguarded pleasure in doing this well. There is a particular satisfaction, distinct and complete in itself, in making $11 stretch across 7 days and coming out the other side with the children fed, the rent paid. and perhaps a dime left over for something that was purely, defiantly for no practical reason at all. Both of these things are true. The constraint was real, and so was the mastery, and so was the pleasure she took in the mastery. She was not a victim of her grocery list. She was, within the narrow field allotted to her, something closer to a virtuoso. Let's follow her to the grocer's, because this is where I want to slow down and show you something that was in 1925 genuinely new enough that Ruth herself could remember as a young bride, when it hadn't existed at all. For most of American history, up to this point, buying groceries meant standing at a counter and telling a clerk what you wanted while it was almost always he fetched it for you from behind the counter, weighed it, wrapped it, and added it to a running account that you settled if you were a respectable household once a month. This system had real virtues. It extended credit through lean weeks. It built a relationship between grocer and customer that carried real information. The grocer knew Ruth, knew her children, knew, roughly, what she could afford, and adjusted his suggestions and his patience accordingly. But it also meant that Ruth's food shopping happened, in a sense, through a male intermediary at every single purchase. She named what she wanted. He decided, in countless small ways, which cut of meat to suggest, what was fresh, what needed to move before it spoiled, what she actually got. By 1925, a new kind of store had begun appearing in towns like Ruth's, the self-service grocery, the ancestor of the supermarket, with goods on open shelves that a customer could pick up, turn over, examine, and choose for herself. Paying in cash at a register on the way out, no running account, no credit, no clerk standing between her and the shelf. Piggly Wiggly had opened the first true self-service grocery store back in 1916, and by the middle of the 20s the model was spreading fast, chain by chain, town by town. I find this genuinely remarkable, and I don't think it gets nearly the attention it deserves as a piece of women's economic history. The self-service grocery store was, in its quiet way, a small revolution in female autonomy. For the first time in the memory of most adult American women, buying food did not require the mediation, judgment, or memory of a man behind a counter. Ruth could pick up a can, read its label, compare its price to the can beside it, and decide herself, with no one watching over her shoulder to nudge the decision, whether it was worth the money. The loss of the running account meant the loss of easy credit and hard weeks, and that was a genuine cost, one that fell hardest on households with the least cushion. But the gain, for a woman like Ruth, was a new and unprecedented directness of economic agency. She was no longer describing her needs to an interpreter. She was choosing. This is not a simple story of progress, and I don't want to tell it to you as one. Both things were true at once. The self-service store gave Ruth more direct control, and it also, quietly, began to strip away the informal safety net that the old credit account system had provided to women managing thin margins. The new efficiency and the new precarity arrived in the same building, on the same day, and nobody chose one without also taking on the other. Let us zoom in closer, because I want you to be standing in that store with her. The shop is narrow and bright, with a wooden floor swept clean each morning, and it smells like sawdust and coffee beans from an open barrel near the door, where customers can scoop their own and have it ground fresh at a machine that grinds with a low, satisfying growl. Ruth has her marbled notebook with her, and in it, in small, tight handwriting, a list that is really a small negotiation with herself, item by item, weighed against the $9.40 she has left for the week after this morning's fixed costs. She buys the flour. She buys a smaller cut of round steak than she'd like, because a larger one would mean cutting into Sunday's egg money and Sunday dinner, a slightly better dinner than the rest of the week with a small dessert. Because Walter's mother sometimes comes and appearances matter on a day like that, is not negotiable in Ruth's private ledger, even though nobody has ever told her it should take priority. She picks up a tin of Calumet baking powder because she has tried the cheaper store brand, once found the biscuits didn't rise as well, and made a private calculation that the 4-cent difference was worth paying to avoid that particular small failure. A failure that, again, nobody but her would fully register, and that she would nonetheless feel. And I want you to notice this because it is exactly the kind of detail this history usually skips past. She pauses at a shelf of tinned vegetables and considers seriously. spending 12 cents on a can of tomatoes rather than putting up her own from a neighbor's garden surplus in August as she has done every year of her marriage. 12 cents doesn't sound like a decision that deserves this much thought, but it was in Ruth's actual arithmetic a meaningful decision, because those 12 cents multiplied across a year of moments just like it were the difference between a small margin of savings and none at all, and because the choice to can her own tomatoes cost her something too, hours of standing over a boiling kettle in August heat jars sterilized, lids sealed the whole day given over to a task that if she bought the tin instead she could spend on something else, mending, reading, sitting on the porch briefly with nothing in her hands. This is what I mean when I say the economics of this decade were skilled, invisible, professional labor. Ruth was in that grocery aisle running a real cost-benefit calculation between her own labor, priced against her own time, and a market alternative priced in cash, the exact kind of calculation an economist would recognize immediately as legitimate economic reasoning performed with real information and real stakes, and performed by a woman the culture around her would have described without a flicker of irony as someone who doesn't work. I want to give you the larger economic picture now, because I promised you real figures, and I want to make good on that promise before we move any further into Ruth's day. By the mid-1920s, the average American family income was somewhere around $2,000 to $2,300 a year for a working or lower middle-class household. Ruth and Walter's $1,100 puts them somewhat below that average, which is deliberate on my part, because I wanted you to feel the texture of a household that had to manage carefully rather than one with room to spare. Of a typical family's spending, food consumed the largest single share, often somewhere between a third and 40% of total income. Clothing took another substantial share, often 10 to 15%, housing another 15 to 20%, and what remained, what economists and advertisers of the era were only beginning to fully understand the size and significance of, was a genuinely new category, discretionary spending on goods that had not existed in any mass form. One generation earlier, ready-made cosmetics, silk stockings, store-bought clothing patterns and ready-to-wear dresses, radios, phonograph records, tickets to the moving pictures, small electrical appliances purchased not all at once but through a new and rapidly spreading arrangement called installment credit, buying now on the promise of paying later in small weekly or monthly amounts. This last innovation, installment buying, deserves its own long pause because it changed the emotional and economic texture of women's spending more than almost anything else in the decade, and it is not talked about nearly enough. Before the widespread arrival of installment credit, a major purchase, a washing machine, say, or a good sewing machine, or later in the decade, an automobile, required saving. It required a woman or a household to accumulate cash over months or years before the purchase could be made, which meant that the desire for the object and the possession of the object were separated often by a long stretch of disciplined waiting. Installment credit collapsed that gap. A washing machine that cost $150, an enormous sum more than 3 months of Walter's entire income, could be brought into the house this week for a down payment of perhaps $10, with the rest paid off at a rate of a few dollars a month over the next 2 or 3 years. I want to be honest with you about what this did, because it is genuinely complicated, and I don't think either the celebratory version or the cautionary version alone tells the whole truth. On one hand, installment buying meant that a woman like Ruth, who spent by some estimates from the era's own domestic labor studies something in the range of 40 to 50 hours a week on unpaid household labor, much of it involving water, hauling it, heating it, wringing it out of heavy wet fabric by hand, could, for the first time in her life, plausibly imagine owning a machine that would take some meaningful fraction of that labor away from her. This was not a small or frivolous hope. Doing laundry by hand for a family of 4 in this period was among the most physically brutal recurring tasks a woman performed. Heavy wet cloth lye-based soap that cracked and reddened the skin, hours of standing, of wringing, of hauling buckets week after week with no end to the cycle in sight, because the cycle was the shape of her life. A washing machine promised to change that shape. It is not hard to understand why women wanted one badly enough to accept years of small weekly payments to get it. On the other hand, and this is the honest complication I want to sit with, installment credit was new enough and aggressive enough in its marketing that it created real financial danger for households that miscalculated, and the burden of managing that danger, like the burden of managing everything else in the household budget, fell overwhelmingly on the woman. If Walter's hours were cut even briefly, and they were more than once, in years when the wholesale trade slowed, it was Ruth who had to find the $2.50 due that month on the washing machine, cutting it from somewhere else, absorbing the shock so that the family would not lose the machine and the payments already made on it. The machine that was supposed to relieve her labor became, in a bad month, one more source of anxious calculation added to her load, not subtracted from it. Both of these things were true. The washing machine was a genuine liberation from one of the cruelest recurring burdens of a woman's physical life. And the washing machine was also a new source of financial risk that she, specifically, was responsible for managing, invisibly, without credit for the skill it required. This is not bitterness, what I'm describing to you. It is something more patient and more complicated than bitterness. It is simply what was true. Let me tell you about Ruth's own washing machine, because she does have one, a second-hand electric wringer model that Walter's brother sold them 2 years ago when he upgraded to a newer model. At a price of $40 paid off at $2 a month for 20 months. Before this machine, Ruth did laundry the old way, a copper boiler on the stove, a washboard, a hand-cranked wringer, an entire day given over to the task Monday after Monday, in a rhythm so universal across American households of every class that Monday itself had become informally wash day, a day on which no housewife in the country would think to schedule a social call, because everyone understood, without being told, what everyone else was doing. With the electric wringer machine, wash day is still a full morning's work. It did not eliminate labor, only reduced it, a distinction that matters enormously and that period advertising dishonestly tended to blur. Ruth still sorts the clothes, still mixes the soap, still feeds each piece by hand into the wringer's rollers, a task with its own particular danger. That thin white scar on her thumb came from exactly this. A moment's inattention. A sleeve caught a machine that did not know the difference between fabric and flesh and simply kept pulling. But the boiling, the scrubbing by hand against a ridged board, the hours of raw physical force applied directly through her own arms and back, that part of the labor genuinely is gone, replaced by a motor. And Ruth is not sentimental about missing it. She does not romanticize the washboard. She is on this point entirely clear-eyed. The machine is better and she is glad to have it, and she thinks of the $2 a month still owed for another 8 months as a fair price for what it is given back to her, which is, in the most literal sense, hours of her own life. I find myself thinking about this often. How much of what we now call women's liberation in the 20th century did not arrive through law or protest first, but through machinery, through the washing machine, the vacuum cleaner, the gas range that replaced the coal stove, each one quietly redistributing hours that had for generations before simply been consumed by the body's raw labor and could now instead belong to something else. Nobody marched for the wringer washer, but it changed the texture of Ruth's Mondays more thoroughly than most legislation of her lifetime would. Let's move to a different room in Ruth's day, and a different kind of spending altogether, because I promised you the full range of what women actually bought in this decade, and food and machinery are only part of it. Let's talk about her body, and what the market had begun, very deliberately, to tell her about it. By 1925, the American cosmetics industry had grown in the space of roughly a decade from something small and faintly disreputable, associated in the previous generation's mind with actresses and women of loose reputation, into a mainstream, respectable, enormous business doing hundreds of millions of dollars in sales annually across the country. This is one of the sharpest and most consequential shifts of the entire decade, and I want to walk through it carefully, because it tells you something important about how a market can reshape what an entire generation of women believes about her own face. In Ruth's mother's generation, a respectable married woman did not, as a rule, wear visible cosmetics. Face powder, applied with real discretion, might be tolerated. Anything more, rouge, lip color, obviously darkened lashes, marked a woman, in the moral shorthand of the era, as a certain kind of woman, and Ruth's mother had raised her with that shorthand firmly in place. But something had shifted gradually, and then suddenly over the years, just before and after the sudden expansion of women's public visibility during the previous decade. women working more visibly outside the home, women voting for the first time following the ratification of the amendment in 1920, women appearing on city streets and offices in the new medium of moving pictures at a scale and a frequency that had no precedent. The moving pictures, especially, mattered enormously here. Actresses on enormous screens, their faces magnified 20 feet high, wearing visible, deliberate cosmetics designed specifically to read under harsh studio lighting, became for millions of women who had never set foot near a studio the new visual standard for an attractive face. And cosmetics companies were extremely quick, extremely deliberate, and extremely effective at connecting their products directly to that new standard. Ruth owns, by 1925, a small tin of face powder. Pond's a brand she trusts because her sister-in-law recommended it, and because its advertisements, which she has seen in the pages of the Ladies' Home Journal, speak in a register of respectable self-improvement rather than overt glamour, a distinction that mattered to Ruth even if she could not have named exactly why. She owns a small jar of cold cream used at night, a genuine and old practice with real skincare logic behind it going back generations, and one that the cosmetics industry had cleverly repackaged and remarketed as something new and essential, rather than something her grandmother had also done in her own kitchen with homemade preparations of her own devising. And she owns, purchased only in the last year after real internal debate, a small tube of lip rouge, a shade the company called, with the era's particular gift for suggestive naming, natural, which she wears only on Sundays, only a very small amount, blotted carefully so that its presence could be denied if pressed as merely healthy color rather than paint. I want to be careful here because I don't want to reduce this to a simple story of women being manipulated by a cynical industry, even though the industry was in fact being cynical, in ways that are well documented in the surviving advertising archives of the period. Copy explicitly designed to manufacture insecurity where none had existed before to convince women that features they had never previously thought to scrutinize were, in fact, deficiencies requiring correction and purchase. That manipulation was real, and it is worth naming plainly. But it would also be dishonest to say that Ruth's lip rouge was purely a symptom of manipulation and nothing else. There was real pleasure in it. There was a genuine, private, small act of self-fashioning in that careful application on a Sunday morning. A moment in front of a small mirror that belonged entirely to her, in which she was not managing anyone's needs but her own, deciding in a very narrow and very real sense what she wanted her own face to say to the world for one morning. I do not say this to be harsh, and I do not say the opposite to be sentimental. I say it because it is important to sit with both truths at once, that the market manufactured a want that had not organically existed, and that the small ritual built around satisfying that want became for Ruth something that was also genuinely hers. Let's talk about the economics of that lip rouge, because I promised you real figures, and because the numbers here tell their own quiet story about who profited and by how much. A tube of quality rouge in this period might cost Ruth somewhere between 50 cents and $1. The actual cost of the materials inside that tube, the tinted wax, the perfume, the tiny brass tube itself, amounted by the honest estimate of contemporary trade analysts to a small fraction of that price, often less than a tenth. The remaining 9/10ths of what Ruth paid went to manufacturing, overhead, distribution, and, the largest single share by far, advertising, the enormous, sustained, psychologically sophisticated campaign of magazine copy and imagery required to convince a generation of respectable married women raised by mothers who considered visible cosmetics disreputable that a small tube of tinted wax was not merely acceptable but necessary. Ruth was not simply buying a product. She was, unknowingly, paying the cost of her own persuasion. This is different from the grocery store in an interesting way, and it's worth pausing to compare the two, because I think the contrast is genuinely illuminating. At the grocery store, Ruth was an expert. She knew the market, she knew the prices, she knew the seasonal rhythms, and she made her decisions from a position of real, hard-won knowledge accumulated over years. At the cosmetics counter, and in the pages of the magazines that told her what her face was supposed to look like, she was operating in a market deliberately designed to keep her slightly off balance, to make her doubt a form of expertise she genuinely possessed nowhere else in her life. Expertise about her own face, her own worth, her own adequacy. The grocery store respected her intelligence because it had to. She could simply walk to a competitor if it didn't, The cosmetics industry, by contrast, thrived precisely by unsettling her confidence, because an unsettled woman bought more than a confident one did. I find this comparison worth sitting with for a long moment, because I think it says something true not only about 1925, but about every decade that has followed it, including, I suspect, your own. Let me bring you back into the house now, because it's nearly noon and Ruth's morning of arithmetic and small decisions is only the beginning of her day, and I want to walk through the rest of it slowly with you before we widen out further into the broader economic and social forces at work around her. The department stores, the mail-order catalogs, the beauty parlors, the radio just beginning to enter houses like hers, all of which are coming in their turn later tonight. For now, though, I want you to notice how much has already happened in this single morning. A marriage's entire weekly income divided and allocated with real skill, a grocery store navigated with the precision of a professional buyer, a small personal choice about her own face made under real cultural pressure and real personal desire, at once both true, both hers to hold, before we go any further into Ruth's afternoon. And there is a great deal more to tell you about her sewing basket, about the mail-order catalog she keeps under a folded tablecloth in the sideboard, about the particular arithmetic of a good winter coat, about the beauty parlor 2 streets over where a permanent wave costs more than Walter earns in 2 full days of work, and about what all of this adds up to. In the end, about power and money and the quiet architecture of a woman's daily life. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually consider the answer even lying there half towards sleep. Where are you watching from tonight? Not the town, not the country necessarily, though I'd love to know that too, but what kind of room are you in? Is it a room you've lived in for years, worn into its particular comfort the way Ruth's kitchen was worn into hers? Or is it new to you, still slightly unfamiliar in the dark? And what time is it for you? Right now, as my voice is the last voice in your room tonight. I asked because I think about that a great deal while I'm building these evenings for you, that somewhere out there at every possible hour someone is exactly where you are right now, letting a story about a woman who has been gone for a century carry them the last stretch into sleep. If you have a moment before you drift off completely, or tomorrow when you wake, I'd love it if you left a comment telling me where you were, and what hour it was when Ruth's kitchen became real to you. And if this evening is doing what I hope it's doing, if it's giving you somewhere quiet to land, a like helps this reach the next person lying awake looking for exactly this. And subscribing means you won't have to go looking for it again next time. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and I'd be grateful for it. Now, let's go back into the house, because Ruth still has a whole day ahead of her, and I have a great deal more to tell you about where the money goes, and why it mattered so much more than anyone at the time was willing to say out loud. Noon in Ruth's kitchen smells different than morning does. The coffee smell is faded, and in its place is something simmering. A pot of navy beans she started before Walter left soaking overnight, and now cooking slow with a small piece of salt pork. A dish that will stretch with cornbread across 2 meals rather than one, a small piece of arithmetic so automatic to Ruth that she no longer experiences it as arithmetic at all, only as the shape her days naturally take. Frances is at school. Tommy is down for a nap that Ruth has learned to guard with real ferocity, because the hour it buys her is the only hour of her entire day that belongs, uninterrupted, to her own hands. She spends part of that hour with her sewing basket. And I want to tell you about the sewing basket for a while, because clothing, what it cost, what it meant, and the extraordinary skill required to manage it well, deserves its own long look tonight. By 1925, ready-to-wear clothing had become far more widely available and far more affordable than it had been even 10 years earlier, and this was in its own quiet way another genuine transformation in women's lives, though a more ambivalent one than the grocery store or the washing machine. A ready-made cotton house dress purchased from a department store or through a mail-order catalog might cost somewhere between $1.50 and $3, depending on quality. A ready-made dress for church or for visiting, made of a nicer fabric with more careful construction, could run anywhere from $5 to $15. These prices sound modest to us now, but set against Ruth's actual weekly resources, that $9 or $10 remaining after fixed costs, meant to cover food and everything else for 7 days, A single ready-made church dress could represent a full week and a half of the entire discretionary budget of the household. This is why Ruth still sews. Not because she cannot afford to buy ready-made clothing at all. She does buy some, particularly for the children whose rapid growth made home sewing a poor economic bet in a different direction. Since a dress carefully constructed for a 7-year-old might not survive to be handed down before it was outgrown. But for herself and for Walter's shirts, and for a great deal of what the household wears across a year, Ruth sews using a treadle machine that Walter's mother gave them as a wedding gift, and patterns purchased for 15 to 25 cents apiece from the pattern counter at the dry goods store. Butterick and McCall's, the two great pattern companies of the era, whose paper envelopes printed with a stylish illustration of the finished garment on the front and impossibly thin tissue instructions folded inside, sat in wide, flat drawers that Ruth flipped through with real, unhurried pleasure on the rare occasion she had a few minutes and a few coins to spend on herself in this particular way. I want you to understand what real skill this required, because I think it is one of the most thoroughly erased forms of expertise from this entire period. Sewing a well-fitted dress from a flat paper pattern is not simple work. It requires an understanding of how two-dimensional fabric becomes three-dimensional form around a specific body. Ruth's own body, which the standardized pattern sizes did not actually match, requiring her to alter the pattern's proportions through a set of techniques she had learned first from her mother and then refined over years through trial error and the unforgiving feedback of an ill-fitting sleeve. It required knowledge of fabric, how a bias-cut skirt behaved differently from a straight one, how certain fabrics needed to be pre-shrunk before cutting or the finished garment would warp after its first wash, how much ease to leave at a seam for a body that might over the coming year change in ways a woman's body reliably does. It required precision with a needle that at its best produced stitches nearly invisible to the eye seams that would hold for years of wear and repeated washing. Buttonholes worked entirely by hand with a particular reinforcing stitch that took real patience to execute cleanly. None of this labor appeared anywhere in any official accounting of the nation's economic output. If Ruth had purchased an equivalent dress ready-made, the transaction would have registered instantly and completely in the era's economic statistics. A sale, a data point, a contribution to the gross measure of the nation's commerce. Because she made it herself, at her own kitchen table, with her own hands, across 4 or 5 evenings of careful work after the children were in bed. It registered nowhere at all. It was not counted. It did not exist in the eyes of the statisticians of the era as economic activity, even though the dress existed undeniably as a physical object of real value requiring real skill, real time, and real judgment to produce. And even though the money it saved the household was every bit as real as money earned. I want to be careful here because I want to say this clearly and without exaggeration. The labor performed by women like Ruth in kitchens and sewing rooms across the country in this decade was by any honest technical standard skilled professional labor, pattern drafting, fabric science, precision handwork, nutrition planning, budget management, market analysis, performed at a level that, had it been performed by a man in a workshop for wages, would have been called a trade. And the person performing it would have been called a tradesman with all the respect and formal recognition that word carried. Because it was performed by a woman, unpaid, inside a private home, it was called nothing. It was simply what a wife did. The invisibility of that labor was not incidental. It was, I think, one of the quiet foundational injustices of the entire economic architecture of the period. Not because any single person intended cruelty, but because an entire system of value had been built brick by brick around the assumption that this kind of work simply didn't count, and once a system is built that way, it does not require anyone's malice to keep grinding along exactly as designed. I want to be careful, too, not to let this observation turn Ruth into a symbol. She was not a martyr to an unjust system, walking through her days in quiet suffering, and it would flatten her and be untrue to her to tell her story that way. She took real, unqualified pride in a dress well made. When Walter said, without any particular insight into what had gone into it, that she looked well in the blue one, something in her chest lifted plainly and simply, the way anyone's does, at being noticed for something they worked hard at. She was not thinking at that moment about the invisibility of her labor or the injustice of an uncounted economy. She was thinking that the dress had come out well, that the darts sat exactly where she wanted them to, that she had solved, with her own hands and her own judgment, a real problem, and solved it elegantly. That pride was real, and it belonged to her, entirely apart from whatever the larger economic system did or didn't acknowledge about its worth. Both things are true, and I don't want to resolve the tension between them for you tonight, because I don't think it should be resolved. The pride was real. The invisibility was also real. She was a skilled professional and an uncounted statistic in the very same body, at the very same kitchen table, in the very same hour. Let me tell you about the sideboard now, and what's kept beneath the folded tablecloth in the bottom drawer, because I think it will tell you something about Ruth that the ledger and the sewing basket, for all their honesty, don't quite reach. It's a Sears Roebuck catalog, the current one, several hundred pages thick, printed on thin paper and already softened at the corners from handling. Nearly every household in America owned one of these by 1925, rural households especially, for whom the catalog represented access to a scale and variety of goods that no local store could match. But town households like Ruth's kept them too, for the simple pleasure of the browsing, which was, in its own quiet way, a form of leisure available to a woman whose leisure time was otherwise almost non-existent. Ruth does not order from the catalog often. Freight and the modest markup made town shopping more practical for most things she actually needed. But 2 or 3 evenings a month, after the children are asleep and before Walter comes in from reading the paper on the porch, she takes the catalog out and turns its pages slowly, at an unhurried pace. She allows herself in almost no other part of her day. I find this small ritual worth pausing on for a long moment, because I think it reveals something true about desire and about what it meant, in this decade, for a woman to want something purely for herself. Most of what Ruth spends across a week is spent on behalf of other people. Food for the children, a coat for Walter, thread and buttons for a dress that will eventually also serve someone else's eye and someone else's judgment of the household's respectability. The catalog is different. In its pages, for a stolen half hour, Ruth is looking at things: a particular shade of ribbon, a smart little cloche hat, a set of embroidered pillowcases, a small travel case she has no earthly use for and no possible occasion to use it in, purely because she wants to look at them, purely because wanting itself, apart from any practical justification, was a pleasure she rationed as carefully as she rationed the coffee. She almost never buys anything from these evenings. That is not, in the end, really the point of them. The point is closer to what a locked diary is for a person who has almost no privacy of any other kind. A small, contained space in which desire is allowed to exist without immediately being converted into duty negotiation or justification to another person. This is the kind of detail I think matters enormously and gets skipped past constantly in how this era is usually told. Not the catalog itself, which everyone knows about, but the specific emotional function it served for a woman like Ruth. Not a shopping list, but a private room made of paper, the only one she had. There's a coat in that catalog she's been returning to for 3 months. A good wool coat, dark green, with a small fur collar, priced at $14.95. Ruth's current winter coat is going into its 5th season, turned once already at the collar and cuffs to hide the worst of the wear, and by any honest measure it is due to be replaced. $14.95 is, in the arithmetic of Ruth's household, an enormous sum, nearly a week and a half of Walter's entire income, more than she has ever spent on a single garment for herself in the 7 years of her marriage. She has not bought it. She may not buy it this year either. But she returns to that page the way a person returns in idle moments to a thought they haven't decided what to do with yet. And I think there is something quietly moving in that. Not the coat itself, but the sustained, patient, unresolved wanting held for months weighed against a household's real and pressing needs, never quite dismissed and never quite acted on. This is not a small emotional life. It is a full one, conducted almost entirely in private, in the margins of a day that belonged, by every formal account, to everyone but her. Let's widen out now, because I've kept us close to Ruth's own kitchen table for a long while, and I want to show you the larger landscape she was operating inside: the beauty parlor, the department store, the new and rapidly changing technology entering houses like hers, because all of it shaped the specific choices I've just walked you through. And I don't want you to think of Ruth as isolated. She existed inside a vast, interconnected system of social pressure, commercial persuasion, and genuine technological change, and understanding that system is the only way to understand her choices fairly. Let's start with the beauty parlor, because I mentioned it earlier, and I want to make good on that. By the middle of the decade, the permanent wave had become one of the great contested luxuries available to American women, and its price tells its own precise story about class, labor, and the market for female appearance. A permanent wave. A chemical and heat process that curled the hair in a style that would hold more or less for several months, sparing a woman the daily labor of setting her hair with irons or rags, cost at a proper salon somewhere between $10 and $25 depending on the town and the salon's pretensions. $10 to $25. Set that beside Ruth's $9 or $10 of weekly discretionary income, and you can see immediately why the permanent wave functioned in this decade as an unmistakable class marker, a visible, unmissable sign that a woman's household had resources well beyond bare necessity, because no household managing on Ruth's margin could absorb that cost without real sacrifice elsewhere. Ruth has never had a professional permanent wave. She has, however, purchased a home wave kit, a smaller, cheaper, considerably riskier version of the same chemical process sold through the same catalog whose pages she turns at night for around $2, promising results similar to the salons, for a fraction of the price. The home version required real courage and real risk tolerance, because the chemicals involved, applied by an inexperienced hand without professional training, could damage hair badly, sometimes irreparably, and Ruth had heard secondhand of at least one neighbor whose home wave had gone badly wrong, leaving her hair brittle and broken for the better part of a year. Ruth tried it once, carefully following the instructions with the same close attention she gave a new sewing pattern, and the result, while not what the catalog illustration promised, was serviceable enough that she considered the $2 well spent. A calculated risk taken with open eyes in pursuit of a small and reasonable version of a luxury she could not afford in its full professional form. I want to sit with this for a moment, because I think it's a perfect small window into something larger, the way the beauty industry of this decade created, at every single price point, a version of the same aspirational product, so that no woman, regardless of her means, was ever quite outside the market's reach. The wealthy woman got the real permanent wave, professionally done, without a second thought about the cost. The middle-income woman, like Ruth, got the $2 home version, with all its real risk. And the poorest women got smaller imitations still, a length of ribbon tied a certain fashionable way, a hairstyle achieved with rags and patience rather than chemicals at all, an approximation built from nothing but skill and time, because time, unlike money, was one resource that even the poorest households usually had more of. Every rung of the economic ladder had its own version of the same desire, priced precisely to that rung's exact capacity to pay, and this precision was not an accident. It was, I think, one of the most sophisticated pieces of market engineering of the entire decade, and it is rarely given credit as the sophisticated thing it actually was. Let's talk, too, about the department store, because it deserves its place in tonight's story, and because it represents something genuinely new in how women were permitted to move through public commercial space. Before the rise of the large urban and small-town department store in the decades leading up to this one, a respectable woman's movement through commercial space had been fairly constrained. She went where she needed to go, transacted her specific business, and left. The department store, with its wide aisles, its ladies' lounges, its tea rooms, its restrooms built specifically to make an extended visit comfortable, was designed quite deliberately to invite women to linger, to browse without buying, to spend an entire afternoon inside its walls as a form of respectable leisure, something that would have been unthinkable for a woman of Ruth's standing in almost any other kind of public building available to her. This mattered enormously, and I don't think it's discussed nearly often enough. The department store was one of the very few genuinely public spaces in early 20th century America that a respectable married woman could occupy alone for hours, without any male escort, and without any social cost to her reputation. Ruth's mother had no real equivalent of this. The department store gave Ruth a form of public autonomy that simply had not existed for women of her exact social position one generation earlier. Ruth visits the department store in the county seat perhaps once every 6 weeks on a day when a neighbor can watch Tommy for a few hours taking the trolley in with a short list of specific needs and, more importantly, with an entire afternoon that belongs in a way so few of her afternoons do to no one's schedule but her own. She rarely buys much, but she moves through the store, the millinery counter, the glove counter, the notions department, with the eye of someone gathering information as much as making purchases, noting what the current fashion silhouette actually looks like up close rather than in a two-dimensional catalog illustration, noting how a hem is finished on a ready-made dress so she can replicate the technique at home, noting prices, always noting prices, filing them away against the running mental ledgers she carries everywhere, whether she is technically shopping or not. This is different from the grocery store and different again from the cosmetics counter, and I think the difference is worth naming clearly. At the grocery store, Ruth was a buyer exercising expertise. At the cosmetics counter, she was a target being persuaded. At the department store, she was something closer to a scholar, a woman conducting careful unpaid research into a visual and material culture she was expected to understand fluently so that her household's appearance, her children's clothes, her own presentation at church and among neighbors would meet a standard that was never written down anywhere, but was nonetheless enforced continuously and completely by the attentive eyes of every other woman in her social circle. And this, the surveillance embedded in that social circle, is something I want to spend real time on before we move toward the later part of this evening, because I think it's the piece of this history that explains more than any single economic figure I've given you, why women like Ruth cared so much, calculated so carefully, and worked so hard to get these small decisions right. There was no single enforcer of the standards Ruth lived inside. No official inspected her house dress or measured the whiteness of her wash on the line or timed how quickly her children's shoes were replaced when they grew too tight, and yet the standards were enforced continuously, completely, by an entire community of women watching one another with an attentiveness that had no formal name and needed none. The wash on the line on a Monday morning was visible to every neighbor on the street, and its whiteness, achieved through a precise combination of bluing agent, sun bleaching, and the sheer physical labor of the scrub, was read silently as a direct measure of a woman's competence and character. A neighbor arriving to borrow a cup of sugar noticed the bread on the counter, the state of the kitchen floor, the children's clothes, and none of it needed to be commented on directly for the judgment to register and to travel in the particular quiet telegraph of a small community to every other woman on the street within days. I want to be careful here, because both things are true at once, and I think it's important not to let one erase the other. This surveillance was real, and it was a genuine source of pressure and anxiety in women's lives, a second unpaid job layered directly on top of the first, the job of being continuously, correctly watched. But the same network of watching women was also, in its other direction, the primary source of real community, real mutual aid, real friendship, and information sharing that made Ruth's life livable at all. The neighbor who noticed the state of her kitchen floor was the same neighbor who, without being asked, brought over a pot of soup the week Tommy had croup, who told her unprompted which grocer was quietly extending credit to families having a hard month, who taught her over a shared afternoon of canning a trick for sealing jars that saved her a spoiled batch every single summer since. The surveillance and the community were not two separate things. They were the very same structure, viewed from two different angles, and Ruth lived inside both angles simultaneously, every single day of her life without ever being able to fully separate the warmth from the watching. I think this is one of the truest and most undertold things about this entire period and about women's social worlds in general. In almost any era you care to examine, that community and surveillance are so often built from the very same material, and a woman inside that structure does not get to choose one without the other. She gets both together always, and she learns, as Ruth learned, to live skillfully inside that particular complicated weather. I want to pause here before we go any further tonight, because I've given you a great deal to sit with, and I think this is a good place to let it settle for a moment before we go deeper still, into the radio just beginning to arrive in houses like Ruth's, into the movies, into what happens when Walter comes home this evening and the whole day's careful arithmetic finally meets the person it was all in the end conducted on behalf of. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, drifting somewhere between waking and not, I'd love to know, when you get the chance, what part of tonight's story you found yourself thinking about longest. Was it the coat in the catalog she hasn't bought? Was it the 12 cents she weighed against a whole day of canning in August heat? Was it the bread on the counter that nobody commented on and everybody noticed? Tell me in a comment, and while you're there, tell me what world you'd like to visit next. I read every single suggestion genuinely, and the next evening I build will come from someone reading these words right now. Leave your idea below, and if I use it, I'll read your name out at the very start of the next episode, so you'll know it was yours. And if tonight has been good company for you, a like and a subscribe. Help this find the next person who needs somewhere quiet to land. It costs you nothing, and it means quite a lot, and I'd be grateful for it. Rest a moment now, if you need to. I'm not finished with Ruth's day yet. There's a whole evening still ahead of her and Walter, and a decision about a radio that I haven't told you about yet, and the slow settling of the house into night, which I want to walk you through as carefully as I've walked you through this morning. But let your eyes close if they want to. I'll still be here, telling it quietly, whether you're awake to catch every word or not. Let's go back to that kitchen table now, because Frances is home from school, dropping her books by the door with the particular clatter of a 7-year-old who has spent all day being quiet and has no intention of continuing the practice, and Tommy is awake from his nap. And the afternoon has that specific texture, half core, half company, that fills the hours between school's end and Walter's return. I want to tell you about the radio now because I think it belongs here in this stretch of the afternoon when the whole household is gathered and the future is quite literally sitting in the corner of the front room in the shape of a decision not yet made. In 1925, the radio was still new enough to feel almost miraculous, and old enough that a household like Ruth's had begun, seriously, to weigh whether to own one. The first commercial broadcasts had only begun a few years earlier in 1920, and by the middle of the decade, the technology had moved with startling speed from a hobbyist's curiosity. Men building their own crystal sets in basements, fiddling with wires and headphones for the sheer technical pleasure of pulling a voice out of the air, into a genuine consumer product sold in furniture store cabinets designed to look at home in a respectable front room, with a horn-shaped speaker that let an entire family listen together rather than passing a single set of headphones from ear to ear. A good radio set in 1925 cost anywhere from $75 to $200 depending on its quality and its cabinetry, a genuinely enormous sum for a household like Ruth's, on par with the washing machine. And like the washing machine, increasingly available through installment payments that made the enormous sum feel, in the moment of purchase, considerably smaller than it actually was. Walter has been talking about it for months in the mild circling way he talks about purchases he wants but hasn't yet worked up the nerve to propose, outright mentioning at dinner that Fred down the street got one, that the reception in town was apparently very good now that a news station had gone up 2 counties over, that a fellow at the wholesale house said the radio had paid for itself already in the sheer entertainment it provided, as though entertainment were the kind of thing that paid for itself in any sense Ruth's ledger would recognize. I find myself thinking about this conversation, the radio conversation, playing out in slightly different words in thousands of kitchens across the country that same spring, because I think it reveals something true about who actually held authority over major household purchases, and how that authority worked in practice rather than in theory. On paper, in the formal legal sense, Walter is the one who could simply decide to buy the radio. The money is, legally, his earnings, and the culture of the era would have recognized his right to make a major purchase without his wife's consent, if he chose to exercise it. But in the actual daily practice of Ruth and Walter's marriage, and in a great many marriages like it, the radio cannot actually arrive in that front room until Ruth has been persuaded. Because it is Ruth who will have to find the monthly payment inside a budget that has no slack in it. Ruth who will have to decide what gets cut to make room for it. Ruth, whose skill and whose sacrifice will actually convert Walter's wish into a functioning reality. Walter can want the radio. Only Ruth can make it real. And both of them know this, even though neither of them would ever describe it in quite those terms. This is the quiet, informal power that I think gets lost in every account of this era that focuses only on the formal legal record, the deeds, the bank accounts, the wages that were, on paper, entirely a man's. Underneath that formal record ran a second, unofficial economy of persuasion, patience, and practical veto, in which women like Ruth held something very close to real power, even while holding almost none of it on paper. She could not have gone to a bank and secured a loan in her own name for a radio in most towns without her husband's signature. But she could, through the simple and total practical necessity of her household management, make the radio impossible indefinitely by declining to find the money for it. And Walter knew this. And so his months of circling mentions of Fred's radio and the good reception 2 counties over were not idle chatter. They were, in their mild and indirect way, a negotiation, conducted with a spouse whose actual cooperation he needed and could not simply command. They did not buy the radio that spring. Ruth tells him gently over dinner that she thinks it's worth waiting until fall, when the coal bill eases and there might be more room. This is true as far as it goes, but it is also, I think, a kind of diplomatic cover for a deeper calculation Ruth has made and not fully voiced, that the washing machine payments still have 8 months left to run, that Frances will need new shoes before the summer is out, that a $200 cabinet radio, however wonderful, is not in her private ranking of the household's actual needs ahead of a working washing machine and 2 children in properly fitting shoes. Walter accepts this without much argument because he trusts her arithmetic, even if he could not, himself, reproduce a single figure of it. This trust, this quiet, unexamined trust that Walter places in Ruth's judgment about money, a trust he would likely never think to call trust at all, simply because it was so total and so unremarked upon, is, I think, one of the genuinely interesting undercurrents of marriages like theirs in this period. He deferred to her on money constantly in dozens of small ways every week, while the culture around both of them insisted loudly and often that men were the ones who understood money and women were the ones who spent it, as though spending were a lesser, softer verb than understanding, when in Ruth's kitchen spending was understanding practiced daily, at a level of precision Walter never had reason to develop. The radio does arrive in the end the following autumn, on the installment plan Walter had assumed all along it would take, at a price of $110 for a modest tabletop model rather than the grander cabinet Fred had bought, a compromise entirely of Ruth's engineering, reached through a series of quiet conversations over several weeks in which she steered the family toward a version of the wish that her ledger could actually absorb. When it does arrive, I want you to know, it changes the shape of their evenings completely and almost immediately in ways that neither of them had quite anticipated. The front room, previously a space Walter occupied alone after dinner with his newspaper, while Ruth mended in the kitchen within earshot of the children, becomes for the first time in their marriage a room the whole family gathers in together, drawn by a voice or a band, playing from a station 2 counties over, Frances lying on the rug with her chin in her hands, Tommy asleep against Ruth's side, before the program even ends. I mention this not to undercut anything I've said about the careful, patient calculation that preceded the purchase, but to hold both things together the way I keep asking you to hold things together tonight. The radio was, in the end, worth exactly what Walter had hoped it would be, and it had arrived in that room only because Ruth had done the quiet, unglamorous, unacknowledged work of making it financially possible on a timeline of her choosing, at a price her ledger could bear. Let me tell you now about the movies, because I promised you the full range of what a woman like Ruth spent her money on, and the moving pictures deserve real attention, both for what they cost and for what they gave back. A ticket to the picture show in a town like Ruth's cost somewhere between 10 and 25 cents in 1925, depending on the house and the hour. A modest sum on its own, but one that, taken as a weekly or twice monthly habit for a whole family, added up across a year to a real and deliberate line item in the household budget, one that Ruth tracked with the same seriousness she gave to flour and coal. And I want to be honest about something that I think gets flattened in a lot of tellings of this era. Going to the pictures was not for a woman like Ruth simply idle entertainment, a frivolous indulgence to be weighed against more serious needs. It functioned as something closer to a form of continuing education, her primary window, alongside the magazines, into a wider visual and social world she had almost no other access to. The pictures showed her fashion months before it reached the pattern counter at the dry goods store. They showed her interiors, the furniture, the drapery, the particular arrangement of a fashionable front room, that shaped in ways she was only half aware of. what she herself aspired to when she had the resources to aspire to anything at all. They showed her, too, a version of romantic and domestic life considerably more glamorous and more emotionally unguarded than anything her own upbringing had prepared her to expect, or even to name. And I think it is worth sitting honestly with what that exposure did to a generation of women raised on a much more restrained emotional vocabulary than the one flickering in front of them at the picture house on a Saturday night. Ruth goes to the pictures perhaps twice a month, sometimes with Walter, sometimes on the months when Walter is tired and disinclined with her sister-in-law, instead the two of them walking the 6 blocks together in the early evening, leaving the children with a neighbor girl paid a dime for 2 hours of minding. This dime, too, is a real line item weighed and accounted for, and I mention it because I want you to see how thoroughly even leisure, even pleasure, was threaded through with the same careful arithmetic that governed the flour and the coal. There was no part of Ruth's life, however small, that existed entirely outside the ledger. Even her joy had a price attached to it, tracked in the marbled notebook alongside everything else. And I think that is worth pausing on, because it is a genuinely different relationship to pleasure than most of us carry today, one in which delight and calculation were never for a moment fully separable. I want to be careful here again, because I don't want you to hear this as a story of joylessness. It was not joyless. It was instead a kind of joy that had learned to live comfortably alongside constraint, the way a person raised near the sea learns to live comfortably alongside tides. They did not choose and cannot control without that constraint diminishing in any real way the actual pleasure of the water. Ruth loved the pictures. She loved the particular darkness of the theater, the smell of it, a mix of cheap perfumed cigarette smoke drifting back from the men's section and the faint burnt sugar smell of popcorn, a snack food only just beginning, in this decade, to become permanently associated with the moving picture experience. She loved the 2 hours in which nobody needed anything from her, in which she was simply a woman watching a story unfold her own considerable expertise, the arithmetic, the sewing, the careful management of a household's entire economic life, entirely, blessedly beside the point. Let's return now to the kitchen, because the afternoon is moving toward evening, and I want to walk you through the last stretch of Ruth's day before we close out tonight's chunk of the story and let you rest properly, with the promise that there is more still to come. Dinner in Ruth's household happens at 6 the moment Walter's key turns in the door, a timing so consistent across the 7 years of their marriage that Ruth could set the potatoes to their final boil by the particular creak of the gate at the end of the walk, a sound she had learned to distinguish without conscious thought from every other sound the street made at that hour. Tonight it's the navy beans from noon stretched with the cornbread she baked while Tommy napped, and a small dish of stewed apples from a bushel Ruth put up herself the previous September, the last of that year's preserving finally reaching the bottom of its jar, just as the first hint of the next season's fruit begins to show at the market stalls, a small, precise, unremarked-upon act of household timing that represents in its quiet way real skill, the ability to preserve exactly enough of a seasonal abundance to carry a family cleanly through to the next one, with to neither waste at one end nor scarcity at the other. Walter comes in tired, in the particular way of a man who has spent his whole day balancing other men's numbers, and has, by 6 o'clock, very little appetite left for numbers of any kind, including his own households. He does not ask Ruth what she spent this week, and this not asking is, I want you to understand itself, a form of trust, rather than a form of neglect, a genuine if unexamined confidence that whatever she has done with the $11 he handed her on Friday morning has been done well, because it always has been, every week for 7 years, without a single instance requiring his intervention or his oversight. This is worth pausing on, because I think it is easy from 100 years' distance to read Walter's non-involvement in the household budget as a form of male indifference to domestic labor, and in some marriages of this era, it certainly was exactly that. But in a great many others, including this one, it functioned instead as the deepest form of professional respect available within the vocabulary of the marriage. He simply did not check her work, the way you do not check the work of a colleague whose competence you have never once had reason to doubt. After dinner, after the dishes are washed and dried and put away, after Tommy is bathed in a shallow tin tub set up beside the stove, and Frances has read aloud and with real pride a full page of her school primer without a single stumble, the house begins its slow settle toward night. Walter takes his paper out to the porch, where the April evening is finally warmed enough to sit comfortably, and Ruth, for the first time since 6:15 that morning, sits down at the kitchen table with nothing whatsoever that needs to be done in the next 5 minutes. This is the hour I want to leave you with tonight, before we pause the story and let you drift the rest of the way into sleep, because I think it is the truest hour of Ruth's entire day. She takes out the marbled notebook one more time, not to plan anything, but simply to look at what the day has actually cost, a habit she has kept since the beginning of her marriage. A kind of nightly accounting that closes the ledger of each day cleanly before the next one opens. The numbers tonight come out almost exactly as she predicted them this morning, which brings her a small private satisfaction that she has never once described to another living soul, because there is no vocabulary available to her in 1925 for describing this particular kind of pride, the pride of a forecast that held of a system that worked, of an entire day's economic life, invisible to everyone but her, executed with real precision from 6:15 in the morning until this exact quiet moment at the kitchen table, with the last of the evening light going soft and blue through the window she cleaned with vinegar water that same morning. A lifetime ago. It feels like, though, it was only this same single day. I find myself thinking often about that particular kind of pride, the pride that has no name, no witness, and no formal record, and yet is every bit as real, every bit as earned, as any pride the culture around Ruth was prepared to recognize and reward. She closes the notebook. She goes out to sit beside Walter on the porch for the last quarter hour before the children need to be put fully to bed, and the street outside settles into the particular hush of small-town evenings in this era. A dog somewhere, a screen door, the last of the birds finishing their business in the maple tree at the corner. No engine sound yet common enough to compete with any of it. We're going to leave Ruth here for tonight, not because her story is finished, because it isn't. Not nearly. There is a great deal more I want to tell you about the department store's credit accounts and what happened to a woman's independence when her husband's name was the only one that could open one, about the beauty parlor conversations that carried real information alongside real gossip about the particular economics of a good winter coat weighed year after year against 100 smaller needs, about what happened to households like Ruth's when a husband's hours were cut, and what that revealed about how thin the margin of security really was beneath even a comfortable, respectable, unremarkable middle-income life, and about the larger currents moving underneath all of it. The rise of consumer credit as a genuinely new force in American life, the specific and calculated psychology of the advertising industry that had, by the middle of this decade, turned the American housewife into the single most studied consumer in the history of commerce, and what all of it meant in the end for women who were told constantly that they didn't work, while working in the fullest and most demanding sense of that word, every single hour they were awake. But that is a story for the next stretch of this evening, and I don't want to rush any of it, because rushing is the one thing I refuse to do with you. For now, let this be enough. Let Ruth sit on that porch a moment longer in your mind, the notebook closed, the street quiet, the whole precise architecture of her day finally, briefly at rest. We'll pick this back up together. For now, if sleep is close, let it come. But if you're still here with me, still comfortable, still willing to let this evening run a while longer, let's go back to that porch, because I told you there was more, and I meant it. Pull the blanket up again if it's slipped. Let your breathing slow back down to the pace it was at a moment ago. We have a good long stretch of the evening left, and I want to spend it properly the way Ruth would have wanted her own hours spent, with care and without hurry. Let's go back a step actually before the porch, because there's a thread I set down earlier that I want to pick back up. The department store, and what happened to a woman's economic identity when she tried to open credit in her own name. I mentioned that the department store was, for Ruth, one of the very few public spaces she could occupy alone for hours without social cost. That was true and it mattered. But I want to complicate it now, gently, because the department store's generosity toward women had a hard edge to it that I don't want to let slide past unexamined. A department store in a town like Ruth's, and in cities more elaborately still, extended what was called a charge account, a running credit relationship that let a favored customer purchase goods across a month and settled a bill in a single payment, much like the old grocer's ledger but grander, and attached to a family name rather than a face the clerk simply recognized. Here is the detail I want you to sit with. In the overwhelming majority of households, the charge account was opened, legally, in the husband's name, even when it was the wife who did essentially all the purchasing on it week after week, year after year, selecting the fabric, the shoes, the household linens, building a genuine and continuous financial relationship with that store through her own judgment and her own taste. The account itself on paper belonged to Walter. Ruth could spend against it freely, within limits the two of them had worked out between themselves, informally, over years of practice. But if something happened to that marriage, and I want to name this plainly because I think it is one of the quieter, harder truths of the whole economic architecture of the period, if Walter died or left, or simply decided unilaterally to close the account, Ruth's years of established creditworthiness, her demonstrated reliability as a customer, her entire financial reputation built through hundreds of careful transactions, evaporated instantly because none of it had ever technically been hers. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to overstate the drama of this for every single household, in every single week. Most marriages of this period did not end in the kind of rupture that would expose this vulnerability directly, and Ruth herself, sitting on that porch beside Walter in the cooling April evening, is not thinking about any of this at all. It sits instead beneath the surface of her life the way a structural fact sits beneath a house, invisible on any ordinary day and entirely determinative on the one day it happens to matter. This is, I think, the honest shape of a great deal of injustice in any era, including our own. Not a daily visible cruelty, but a quiet structural arrangement, unnoticed by the people living comfortably within it, that reveals its true weight only in the rare, terrible moment when the arrangement is tested. There's a particular kind of woman in every town in this period who had learned this lesson the hard way, and Ruth knew one of them, a widow 2 streets over, named, let's say, Edith, whose husband had died suddenly of a fever 3 years earlier, leaving her at 34 with 3 children and a household economy she had in fact managed with real skill for the entirety of her marriage, exactly as Ruth manages her own. And yet in the weeks after her husband's death, Edith discovered that the store accounts closed on her instantly, that the bank required a male relative's signature to release funds from an account she had in every practical sense been the primary manager of for a decade, that her own demonstrated competence, refined over years, counted for nothing in the eyes of an economic system built entirely around the presumption of a man's name at the top of the ledger. Ruth does not think about Edith consciously very often, but I want to suggest to you gently that Edith's example lives somewhere in the back of Ruth's mind on every single occasion she opens that marbled notebook, in the particular carefulness with which she has, without ever quite articulating why, insisted on keeping her own small savings account, the one the bank clerk had raised an eyebrow at years ago, entirely separate from anything attached to Walter's name. It is not distrust of Walter, exactly. It is something closer to a private, unspoken understanding shared by a great many women of her generation, that competence alone, however real, however total, did not guarantee security, and that a woman who wanted any margin of protection for herself had to build it quietly on her own initiative, because the larger system was never going to build it for her. I want to be careful here, because I don't say this to make Ruth's marriage sound fragile or unhappy. It is neither. Walter is, by every account I've built into this story, a decent and reasonably attentive husband, and their marriage, 7 years in, is a genuinely companionable one. But even inside a good marriage in this decade, a woman's financial existence was conditional, in a way a man simply was not, and I think it is important to say that plainly, without either softening it into sentimentality or exaggerating it into melodrama. This is not bitterness. It is something more patient and more complicated than bitterness. It is simply the architecture Ruth lived inside, and lived inside skillfully, and the small separate savings account in her own name was one of the quiet, competent ways she had learned to build herself a margin of safety within an architecture that offered her none by default. Let's go now to the beauty parlor because I promised you that conversation, and I think it deserves its place here as a counterweight to the harder edge of what I've just told you. Because the beauty parlor, whatever its costs and its vanities, was also genuinely one of the great informal information networks available to women of this period. And I don't want you to miss that. Ruthstown has one proper beauty parlor by 1925, run by a woman named, let's say, Vivian, who trained in the city and came back to open her own shop above the dry goods store. A genuinely unusual and genuinely admirable act of independent female enterprise for the era. One that Ruth, along with most of the women in town, regarded with a mixture of real respect and a faint, unexamined suspicion reserved for any woman who had built something entirely her own outside the structure of a husband's income. Vivian's shop does hair, the setting the occasional home territory encroaching permanent wave for those willing to pay the full price. And it does a modest trade in manicures, a service so genuinely new to a town like Ruth's that most of the older women in the community considered it an almost scandalous indulgence, an idea that a woman's hands, having done a full day's labor, deserved any attention at all beyond the labor itself. Ruth visits Vivian's shop perhaps 4 times a year for special occasions, mostly weddings and the rare formal church event, when a proper set is worth the 25 or 30 cents it costs. But I want to tell you what actually happens inside that shop during those visits, because the service itself is almost beside the point. The beauty parlor in this decade functioned as one of the very few spaces where women gathered specifically to talk at length without the presence or oversight of any man in a setting that was fully respectable, fully sanctioned, and yet almost entirely free of the domestic obligations that governed every other space they occupied together. Church socials had their own performance to maintain. A visit over the back fence was always, potentially, interruptible by a child or a husband's return. Vivian's shop, for the 20 minutes or half hour a woman sat under her hands, was different. A small, contained pocket of time in which real information moved freely between women who trusted the room's particular privacy. It was in rooms like this, I think, that a genuinely significant amount of practical female knowledge circulated in this period. Which doctor in the county actually listened to a woman's own account of her symptoms rather than dismissing them? Which husband in town had a temper that made his wife's Sunday sleeves a little longer than fashion required? Which household was quietly struggling despite a respectable public face? And which grocer, again, was worth the walk across town for the credit he'd extend without judgment in a hard month? None of this was written down anywhere. None of it would appear in any historical record, in any newspaper, in any official account of the era's economy or its social structure. And yet it constituted, I think, one of the most important information systems available to women like Ruth, a real functioning, entirely informal network of mutual knowledge and mutual protection, built and maintained almost entirely inside spaces the wider culture considered frivolous. I find myself thinking about this often, how much of the real intelligence of a community, the knowledge that actually kept people safe, actually helped them navigate hard months, actually passed practical wisdom from one generation of women to the next, moved through channels the culture dismissed as gossip, as vanity, as unserious female chatter, precisely because dismissing those channels as unserious meant nobody in power ever had to reckon with how much genuine information and genuine power actually flowed through them. Now let me tell you about the winter coat, because I raised it earlier, and I want to give it the full attention it deserves. Because I think it is one of the clearest single examples of everything we've discussed tonight, compressed into one recurring yearly decision. A good winter coat for a woman like Ruth was not a casual purchase, and I want you to understand the layers of calculation that sat behind it because they illustrate in miniature the entire structure of a woman's economic reasoning in this period. A coat had to last realistically 4 to 6 years of hard use. Ruth's current one, as I mentioned, is going into its 5th season, already turned once at the collar and cuffs. It had to be warm enough for a genuine Midwestern winter, which meant real wool, not a cheaper cotton wool blend that looked similar on the rack, but broke down after 2 seasons of real cold. It had to be a color and a cut conservative enough not to look conspicuously unfashionable by year 4 or 5 when styles would inevitably have shifted, but not so aggressively fashionable in year 1 that it would look dated and try hard well before its useful life was over. a genuinely sophisticated piece of forecasting requiring Ruth to predict with real accuracy the trajectory of a fashion cycle she had no formal training in reading, but had learned to read anyway, through years of careful attention to the department store windows and the catalog pages and the coats other respectable women in town were wearing this season versus last. And it had to fit not just her body as it was in the year of purchase, but her body across the coming half-decade, accounting, without ever being stated aloud, for the real possibility of another pregnancy, for the ordinary changes a woman's body goes through across her late 20s and into her 30s, for a margin of adjustability that a good coat cut with slightly generous seams that could be let out later if needed was expected to provide. This is an extraordinary amount of forecasting and technical judgment to bring to bear on a single garment, and I want to say plainly, nobody in 1925 would have described what Ruth was doing when she considered a winter coat as a sophisticated act of financial and material planning. It would have been described, if it was described at all, as a woman being fussy about her clothes. But strip away the dismissive framing and look at the actual cognitive work being performed. Multi-year cost amortization, fashion cycle forecasting, textile durability assessment, body change contingency planning, all conducted under a hard budget constraint with real consequences for error. And you are looking, I think, at a form of expertise that would be recognized instantly and compensated accordingly if it were performed by a purchasing agent for a business rather than a wife for a household. The skill was identical. The recognition was not. Ruth does in the end buy that $14.95 green coat from the catalog, not this spring but the following autumn, nearly a year and a half after she first found the page, timed carefully to a season when the washing machine payments have finally finished, and a small margin has opened up in the household budget for the first time in 2 years. I want to tell you about the day it arrives, because I think it matters. It comes by parcel post wrapped in brown paper, and Ruth opens it at the kitchen table with a care that has nothing to do with fragility and everything to do with the length of the wanting that preceded it. She tries it on in front of the small mirror in the front hall, the only mirror in the house that shows more than her face and shoulders, and I want you to know that she stands there, in that coat for longer than strictly necessary to confirm the fit, turning slightly, watching the fall of the fabric, in a private moment of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction that she has in fact earned twice over, once through 7 years of careful household management that made the eventual purchase possible at all, and once through 18 months of patient, unhurried wanting that never once curdled into resentment or reckless impulse. This is the part that almost nobody talks about when they talk about this decade. Not the coat itself, and not even the cost of it, but the sheer, sustained emotional discipline required to want something for a year and a half without either suppressing the want entirely or acting on it recklessly before the household could actually bear it. That discipline is its own kind of skill, distinct from the arithmetic, distinct from the sewing, distinct from the market knowledge. An emotional competence that governed desire itself that Ruth had practiced and refined across her entire adult life. And that deserves, I think, to be named as clearly as any of the other forms of expertise we've discussed tonight. I want to widen out now before we come back to Ruth for the final stretch of this evening, because I promised you the larger picture, the forces moving underneath all of these individual careful decisions, shaping them in ways Ruth herself could only partially see. By the middle of the 1920s, American business had discovered something that would reshape the entire structure of the national economy for the rest of the century. That the household, and specifically the woman managing it, was the single most important market in the country, and that market could be studied, understood, and influenced with the same rigor previously reserved for industrial production. Advertising agencies began, in this decade, employing psychologists in earnest, applying genuinely sophisticated theories of motivation, insecurity, and aspiration to the specific task of selling soap, cosmetics, canned goods, and household appliances to women like Ruth. This was not incidental or accidental. It was a deliberate, well-funded, increasingly scientific project, and its central insight, an insight the industry articulated to itself with startling frankness in its internal trade publications, even while its public-facing advertising maintained a much gentler tone, was that the American housewife controlled the overwhelming majority of consumer spending, and that whoever could most effectively shape her judgment about what constituted a good household, a good meal, a good complexion, a good mother stood to capture an economic prize larger than almost any other available in the entire economy. I find this worth sitting with for a long moment, because I think it reframes everything we've discussed tonight in a slightly different light. Ruth's careful, skilled, hard-won expertise in managing her household spending was not operating in a neutral field. It was operating inside a market that had identified her specifically as its most valuable and most actively cultivated target, and that had assembled real scientific and financial resources toward the specific project of shaping her decisions in directions that served the seller's interest rather than necessarily her own. This does not mean Ruth was a passive victim of that project. I want to be careful, again, not to flatten her into that shape. She brought real, independent judgment to every purchase we've discussed tonight, judgment sharpened by direct experience and community knowledge that no advertisement could fully override. But it would be dishonest to pretend she operated on a level field, entirely free of manipulation, simply because she was skilled. Skill and vulnerability to manipulation are not opposites. They coexisted in Ruth's daily life, the same way pride and invisibility coexisted, the same way community and surveillance coexisted. This decade, more than almost any other I've spent an evening with you inside, seems built entirely from pairs like this. Genuine, load-bearing contradictions that do not resolve, and were never meant to. Let me tell you too about what happened in households like Ruth's when the fixed income at the center of all this careful arithmetic wavered, because I think it's important not to leave you with the impression that the system I've described tonight was stable, or that Ruth's skill guaranteed her security. It did not, and I want to be honest about that. There is a stretch the following winter when the wholesale house Walter works for slows its business considerably, and his hours along with several other men's are cut. Not eliminated but reduced. His pay dropping from $1,100 a year to something closer to $900 for a period of nearly 5 months. I want to walk you through what this actually meant inside Ruth's household, because it is, I think, the clearest possible demonstration of everything this evening has been trying to show you. The fixed costs did not shrink to match the smaller income. Rent remained $18 a month. Coal, in the depths of winter, remained a real and unavoidable expense. What shrank entirely was the discretionary margin, the $9 or $10 a week that had in ordinary times covered food beyond the barest minimum, the occasional trip to the pictures, the slow, patient accumulation toward a coat or a radio. Ruth's response to this contraction, executed without any external guidance, without any formal training beyond what 7 years of practice had given her, was a masterclass in crisis management that I don't think has ever been properly credited as exactly that. She suspended the picture show visits entirely. She let the small, separate savings account sit untouched rather than drawing from and treating it correctly, as an emergency reserve rather than a supplement to ordinary spending. Exactly the kind of financial discipline a trained household manager would be praised for in any formal economic account of the period, had anyone thought to formally account for it. She shifted the family's diet toward cheaper proteins and more of her own preserved goods, drawing down the pantry shelves she had spent the previous summer stocking in a piece of forward planning that months earlier had looked merely prudent and now looked in retrospect like something closer to foresight. She let out the seams of Frances's dresses rather than replacing them, mended Walter's shirts rather than considering new ones, and found through a combination of skill and sheer stubbornness a way to keep every single payment on the washing machine current, because she understood correctly that missing a payment on an installment purchase carried consequences. The loss of the machine already partly paid for, a damaged relationship with the store's credit department that outweighed almost any other short-term sacrifice she could make instead. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make this sound like an easy or a painless 5 months, and it was neither. There were real quiet anxieties that Ruth carried largely alone, because carrying them alone was in the specific arithmetic of her marriage. Part of the job, Walter came home from a day of reduced hours already carrying his own private weight about it, and Ruth judged correctly, I think, that adding the full visible weight of her own daily financial anxiety onto his would help neither of them. And so she carried a great deal of it, silently working it through in the marbled notebook at night, at that same kitchen table, long after Walter had gone to bed. This is not bitterness, what I'm describing. It is something more patient and more complicated than bitterness. It is simply the shape her particular competence took under pressure, and I think it deserves to be recognized clearly and without romanticizing the difficulty of it as a genuine act of skilled crisis leadership. performed by a woman the culture around her would never have thought to describe using that word. The wholesale house's business recovers by spring. Walter's hours return to their normal schedule, and the household within a few months is more or less back to where it had been the previous autumn, the washing machine payments still current, the small savings account still intact. The family having weathered 5 genuinely difficult months without a single visible crack in its respectable public face. Nobody outside the household, I want you to understand, ever fully knew how close to the edge those months had actually run. The wash on Ruth's line was exactly as white as it had always been. The children's shoes, though carefully maintained rather than replaced, never looked visibly worn to a passing neighbor's eye. This too was skill, the skill of managing not only the household's actual resources but its outward presentation, maintaining the precise, unspoken standard the community expected, even while the resources behind that standard had, for a stretch of months, been stretched about as thin as they could go without breaking. I find myself thinking about this a great deal, this particular kind of quiet, unwitnessed heroism, if I can even use that word without it sounding too grand for what was in Ruth's own mind simply Tuesday. Simply the ordinary work of being the person responsible for a household's survival. It is not the kind of story that gets told in the large historical accounts of this decade, which tend to focus on the visible drama, the market crash still 4 years off the flappers, the speakeasies, the large public events that make for a clean historical narrative. The real drama for a woman like Ruth played out in 5 quiet months of substituted proteins and mended sleeves and a savings account left deliberately disciplinedly untouched, and I don't think it is any less dramatic in the end, for having happened almost entirely inside one woman's private arithmetic, unwitnessed by history. Before we go back to the porch, I want to tell you about one more thread in the story, because I think it belongs here, and because it will help you understand something about how this whole economic world actually held together day to day, without any of the formal safety nets we might expect to find underneath it. Let me tell you about Ruth's mother, because I mentioned her only briefly, in passing, and I think she deserves more than that. Ruth's mother. Let's call her Cora, a name a full generation older than Ruth's, belonging to a woman born not long after the end of the previous century, lives 4 miles outside town, on the farm where Ruth herself grew up, a farm that by 1925 is worked mostly by Ruth's older brother and his wife, with Cora widowed some years now, living in a small addition built onto the main house specifically for her in the arrangement that was in this period, the ordinary and expected fate of a widowed mother whose children had reached adulthood. I want to tell you about Cora's economic life briefly because the contrast between her generation and Ruth's tells you something important about how quickly the material texture of American domestic life was changing in these years. More quickly, in fact, than almost any other stretch of American history before it. Cora did not have a wringer washer, electric or otherwise, for the great majority of her married life. She did not have a self-service grocery store within reach, buying instead almost entirely from what the farm itself produced, supplemented by a monthly trip to a general store that operated on exactly the old running account system Ruth's own town had only recently begun to move away from. Cora never owned a tube of manufactured lip rouge in her life, and would have regarded the very idea well into her 60s with the same faint suspicion her own mother had regarded it with a generation before that. She sewed everything the family wore from cloth she sometimes wove herself in the earliest years of her marriage, using techniques that were already, by the time Ruth was born, beginning to feel old-fashioned even in a farming community not otherwise known for keeping pace with fashion. And yet, and I think this is worth sitting with for a long moment, Cora's economic authority within her own household, in her own time, was in some ways even more total than Ruth's is in hers. On a working farm in this period, cash was scarce and infrequent, arriving mostly at harvest and at the sale of livestock, and the household's actual survival across the long stretches between those cash moments depended almost entirely on a woman's skill at converting the farm's raw production, milk, eggs, garden vegetables, preserved meat, into a diet that would carry a family of 6 or 7 through a full year without any of the flexibility that Ruth's weekly cash envelope, however tight, still provided. Cora's arithmetic was, if anything, less forgiving than Ruth's, conducted with even less margin for error over an even longer horizon, with genuine physical survival rather than merely comfort or reputation. sometimes resting directly on whether she had judged correctly how many jars of preserved beans a winter actually required. I find myself thinking about this handoff between generations often, not as a simple story of progress, mother to daughter, hardship easing gradually into comfort, though there is some truth in that shape. It's more interesting, I think, than that. Cora's skills and Ruth's skills are not really the same skills at all, even though they rhyme with each other, even though Ruth clearly learned the deep structure of household management, the discipline, the forecasting, the capacity to hold a dozen variables in her head at once, directly from watching her mother do it first, in a kitchen with none of Ruth's conveniences and all Ruth's underlying demands. What changed across that one generation was not the fundamental requirement for skill. It was the specific material the skill had to be applied to: cash instead of raw farm production, manufactured goods instead of homemade ones, a self-service shelf instead of a counter clerk. The competence itself, passed down essentially whole from Cora to Ruth, simply found a new set of tools to work with. This matters, I think, because it corrects something that I believe gets flattened badly in how this decade usually gets told to us: the sense that the 1920s represented some sudden sharp break from a simpler, harder past into a recognizably modern, convenience-filled present. The truth, at least as it played out in a household like Ruth's, was gentler and more continuous than that. She was not a new kind of woman, unrelated to her mother's kind. She was her mother's daughter, carrying forward the exact same demanding, unglamorous, unrecognized expertise, simply exercised now against washing machines and self-service groceries instead of hand looms and general store credit. The tools changed, generation to generation, faster than almost any tools had changed before in human history. The underlying skill required to wield them well changed hardly at all. Cora visits perhaps once a month, brought in by Ruth's brother on a market day, and I want to tell you about what happens on these visits, because I think it illustrates something warm that I don't want this evening to leave out. Cora and Ruth spend these visits mostly in the kitchen, and the conversation between them on the surface is almost entirely practical: a recipe adjusted, a preserving technique compared, a piece of news about a cousin or a neighbor passed along in the particular economical language of women who have a great deal of information to exchange and only a few hours in which to exchange it. But underneath the practical surface, I think, runs something closer to an apprenticeship still quietly in progress, even now, with Ruth a married woman of 31 and a mother twice over herself. Cora still teaches her daughter things in the oblique, non-instructional way that mothers of this generation most often taught, not by sitting her down and explaining, but by doing a thing in front of her and letting Ruth absorb the method through simple, repeated observation, the way Ruth had learned to soda can, to judge the readiness of a loaf of bread by its sound when tapped decades earlier, at exactly the same kitchen table from exactly the same pair of hands, now a little more spotted, a little slower, but no less sure. I want to draw your attention to one particular exchange, because I think it captures something true about how financial wisdom passed between women in this period, entirely outside any formal system of education or credentialing. On one of these visits, not long after the difficult winter I told you about, when Walter's hours had finally returned to normal, Cora asks Ruth in the plain, unemotional way she asks about most things, how the family managed during the lean months. Ruth tells her briefly, factually, the suspended picture shows, the untouched savings, the careful maintenance of the washing machine payments, the stretched pantry. Cora listens, and then says something that Ruth will remember for the rest of her life, though it is delivered so plainly, in so little time, that a stranger overhearing it would never have registered its weight. She tells her daughter that she did exactly right not to touch the emergency money for ordinary shortfalls, because an emergency fund spent on an ordinary difficulty is no longer there for the real one that always, eventually comes. This is in its entirety a complete and sophisticated principle of financial risk management, the kind of thing a modern financial advisor would charge a fee to explain to you, delivered by a widowed farmwoman to her married daughter across a kitchen table in under 20 seconds with no fanfare whatsoever, because it was simply to both of them self-evidently true, the kind of hard-won wisdom that had been tested directly against real scarcity, real winters, real years when the harvest came in thin, and had proven itself correct enough times that it no longer needed to be argued for. It only needed to be said. This is the part that almost nobody talks about when we talk about how financial literacy actually spread in America in this era before it had any of the institutional forms we'd recognize today. No financial advisors, no personal finance columns with any real technical sophistication, yet no formal education in household economics beyond what a home economics course at a land-grant college might offer a small minority of young women. The actual functioning transmission of financial wisdom in households like Ruth's ran almost entirely through exactly this channel, mother to daughter at a kitchen table, in observations too brief and too embedded in ordinary conversation to ever be recorded as the sophisticated financial education they actually were. Let me tell you, too, about the wider network of women around Ruth, because I don't want you to think of her competence as something she built entirely alone in isolation, through only her own private ledger and her mother's occasional visits. The neighborhood itself functioned as a genuine, if entirely informal, mutual aid system, and I think it deserves its own moment of attention before we close. There is a woman 2 doors down, let's call her Marguerite, married to a railroad man, whose household runs on a schedule almost the mirror image of Ruth's. Her husband paid every 2 weeks rather than every week, in a slightly larger lump sum that required its own different, equally demanding style of budgeting to stretch evenly across the intervening days. Ruth and Marguerite have developed over years of proximity an informal system of exchange that functioned almost like a private economy running parallel to, and entirely outside, the cash economy either of their husbands' wages moved through. A cup of sugar borrowed on a Tuesday returned not always in sugar, but in whatever currency of favor the borrower had available, an afternoon's minding of the other's children, a hand with a hem that needed finishing before Sunday, a piece of information about a sale at the dry goods store passed along before it became general knowledge. I want to be precise about what this actually was, because I think the word neighborliness, which is how it would have been described at the time, undersells the real economic sophistication of the system. What Ruth and Marguerite maintained between them was in effect a form of credit and insurance entirely outside the formal banking and credit system that governed their husbands' more visible economic lives, a system with no interest, no formal accounting, and yet a real mutually understood ledger of obligation that both women tracked informally, but precisely in their heads, and that neither would have dreamed of letting drift too far out of balance in either direction. Marguerite's help during Ruth's hardest week of that difficult winter, 3 consecutive days of watching Tommy so Ruth could take in mending for a small cash payment from a woman across town. Work Ruth would not otherwise have had time to do was never formally repaid in any single transaction. It was repaid instead across the following year in 100 small increments. An afternoon here, a jar of preserves there, and a rhythm of reciprocity so continuous and so unremarkable that neither woman experienced it day to day as a system at all. It simply was how women who lived near each other in this period survived the gaps that neither cash income nor any formal institution was prepared to cover. I find this worth naming clearly because I think it is one of the genuinely undervalued economic structures of the entire era. An entire second economy built and maintained almost exclusively by women, running on trust, reciprocity, and shared skill rather than currency, invisible to every official measure of the nation's economic activity, and yet absolutely essential to the actual survival of households like Ruth's and Marguerite's, particularly in the exact kind of lean stretch that the formal cash economy handled so poorly. When economists of the era calculated the nation's output, none of this appeared anywhere in the figures. And yet, without it, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that a great many households in towns exactly like this one would not have made it through their hardest winters intact. There is something in this, I think, that connects back to everything else we've discussed tonight. The same pattern, appearing again at a different scale. The real economic architecture that kept American households functioning through this decade of genuine rapid material change was built substantially by women exercised with real skill and real sophistication, and almost entirely uncounted, unnamed, and unrecognized by the formal systems that existed alongside it. Ruth's marbled notebook, Cora's 22nd lesson in financial risk, Marguerite's 3 days of minding Tommy, repaid across a year in 100 small kindnesses. None of it in any ledger anyone official ever checked. All of it, in the most literal sense, holding the entire structure up. I want to give you one more piece of this world before we go back to Ruth for the last time tonight. because there's a whole layer of quietly disappearing and quietly arriving technology running underneath everything I've described so far, and I don't want to let this evening pass without naming it directly. Let's talk about the telephone for a moment, because Ruth's house does not have one, and I think the reason why tells you something worth knowing. A home telephone line in a town like Ruth's by 1925 cost somewhere around $2 to $3 a month for basic service. Not an enormous sum on its own, but set against the household's other fixed monthly costs. It represented a real and continuous strain that Ruth and Walter have discussed more than once and decided each time against. There's a telephone at the corner drugstore available for a nickel a call in genuine emergencies, and there is one at Walter's brother's house 3 streets over that Ruth can use for anything urgent enough to justify the walk. This arrangement, a household without its own line relying on a network of nearby accessible telephones belonging to others, was extremely common in this period, and it is worth pausing on because the telephone's slow, uneven spread through towns like Ruth's is itself a kind of map of the era's economic stratification, town by town, house by house, a service that some households considered as essential as electricity itself, and others like Ruth's filed away as a genuine but not yet justified luxury. I find this interesting to sit with because it shows you something about how a woman like Ruth actually evaluated new technology, which was almost never a simple, single verdict, worth it or not worth it, but a continuous ongoing recalculation revisited every time the household circumstances shifted even slightly. The telephone had been considered in decline the previous year when the washing machine payments were still active. It will be considered again, and very possibly accepted the following year, once a little more margin is opened up. Nothing in Ruth's economic life was ever decided once and left alone. Everything remained open for reconsideration continuously against a moving set of constraints that never stayed still for long, which is, I think, part of why the mental labor of running a household in this decade was so genuinely exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort at all. It was the sheer, unceasing cognitive load of 100 ongoing evaluations, none of them ever fully settled, all of them requiring fresh attention every time circumstances shifted even slightly in one direction or another. Let's talk too about the icebox, because I mentioned it only briefly earlier, and I think it deserves a longer look, because it sits at exactly the hinge point between an old technology and a new one. And Ruth's household is living directly inside that hinge. The icebox that sits on Ruth's back porch, cooled by blocks of ice delivered 3 times a week in warm weather, represents technology that is by 1925 already decades old, refined and reliable, but fundamentally limited in ways that everyone using one understood intimately. It required a drip pan emptied daily, a genuine skill in judging exactly how much ice to order against the week's expected heat, and a real discipline about which foods could be trusted to keep and which needed to be used quickly or preserved through canning before they spoiled. The electric refrigerator, by contrast, the technology Ruth has seen advertised, has seen in the department store's small appliance section, has read about in the same magazines that sell her cosmetics and her cold cream, represents something genuinely transformative, not merely convenient, continuous, reliable cold with no ice delivery, no drip pan, no daily attention required at all. But at $200 to $300, an electric refrigerator remains for Ruth's household entirely theoretical in 1925. A piece of the near future she can see clearly through the department store's plate glass, without yet being able to reach it. I want you to notice something about this because I think it's a genuinely poignant piece of what it must have felt like to live through this particular decade specifically. As opposed to almost any other, the felt experience of watching your own future arrive slightly ahead of your capacity to afford it displayed behind glass, described in magazines, discussed by neighbors slightly further up the economic ladder who already had one while you yourself continued to manage the older technology, competently, patiently watching the gap between what existed and what you could reach slowly, gradually close. This is different from earlier eras in an interesting way worth following for a moment. In Cora's early married life on the farm, the technology available to a household changed slowly enough generation to generation that a woman rarely had the specific, concrete experience of seeing the very next stage of her own domestic life on display, price dated and just barely out of reach. Ruth, by contrast, lives inside a decade where technological change is moving fast enough that she experiences this exact sensation constantly. The refrigerator, the automobile, eventually within another handful of years. Technologies that don't even exist yet in any form she could currently imagine. This particular flavor of anticipation, this specific way of living slightly behind your own visible future, is, I think, one of the genuinely distinctive emotional textures of this decade, different in kind from what her mother experienced, and different, too, from the pace of change either of us has ever had to sit with in quite the same way. There is one more technology I want to mention before we go back to Ruth, and it's a small one. Easy to miss, but I think it belongs here. Rayon. By the middle of the decade, a manufactured fiber called rayon, marketed for a time under the more evocative name artificial silk, had begun appearing in dress goods and most significantly in stockings, offering something close to the appearance of real silk at a fraction of silk's cost. A pair of genuine silk stockings in this period might cost anywhere from $1.50 to $3, a real and carefully weighed expense for a woman like Ruth who owned at any given time. Perhaps two good pairs, mended at the toe with a fineness of stitching that required real skill to keep invisible, reserved for church and for the rare formal occasion. Rayon stockings, by contrast, could be had for as little as 40 to 60 cents a difference, substantial enough to matter enormously to a household budget like Ruth's, even though the rayon fiber itself ran and snagged more easily than silk did, requiring its own compensating care. This is different from the coat, from the cosmetics, from almost everything else we've discussed tonight, because rayon represents something genuinely new in the texture of American consumption, a manufactured substitute deliberately engineered to approximate a luxury good at a price the broader population could actually reach, and its arrival, across this decade and into the next, would quietly reshape what respectable appearance even meant for a woman of Ruth's means. Where her mother's generation had drawn a clear, largely unbridgeable line between women who could afford silk and women who could not, Ruth's generation lived inside a world where that line had begun, for the first time, to blur, not disappear entirely, because a knowledgeable eye could still tell real silk from rayon at a glance, and everyone in Ruth's social circle knew exactly how to look for the difference, and a subtle new form of the same old scrutiny we discussed earlier on the wash line. But the blur was real and it mattered, and it is one small concrete example of how the manufactured goods of this decade were beginning unevenly and incompletely to soften some of the harder class distinctions that had governed appearance in Cora's generation. I find myself thinking about this a great deal, actually. How a single manufactured fiber, cheap and imperfect and derided by the most fashionable women as an obvious substitute, could nonetheless represent, for a woman like Ruth, a genuine expansion of what her own two legs on a Sunday morning were permitted to look like, at a price her ledger could actually bear more than twice a year. Progress, in this decade, so rarely arrived as a clean, single, obviously positive event. It arrived instead in exactly this partial, uneven, compromised shape. A fiber that ran too easily that a sharp eye could still tell from the real thing, and that nonetheless quietly expanded the reach of respectable appearance to women who had never before been able to reach it at all. Let's come back to the porch now, because I want to close this evening properly, the way I always do, with Ruth herself, and with the particular quiet of a house settling in tonight. It's later now, not that same April evening we left her on, but a different one, further along, closer to the end of the story I want to tell you tonight. Let's say it's early autumn, a year and a half after we first met her, some weeks after that green coat finally arrived by parcel post. The evenings have gone cool enough that the porch sitting has moved indoors to the front room where the radio now sits, arrived as promised that first autumn. The modest tabletop model Ruth's careful engineering had made possible, and the whole family gathers there most evenings now, a habit so thoroughly settled into the household's rhythm that it is hard already to remember clearly what the evenings had been like before it. Tommy is 5 now, Frances 9, and Ruth herself is 31, though I don't think she experiences the passage of those particular years as a story with a clear shape, the way we might tell it looking back. She experiences it mostly the way all of us experience our own lives while we're living them, as an unbroken succession of Mondays and Fridays of grocery arithmetic and mended hems of small private satisfactions and small private worries. rarely stepping back far enough to see the whole pattern she has, in fact, been weaving stitch by careful stitch across every single one of those days. Let me walk you through this particular evening slowly, because I want it to be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight. Dinner is finished. The dishes are dried and put away. Frances is at the kitchen table finishing a piece of schoolwork under the lamp, her tongue caught slightly between her teeth in concentration, a habit she does not know she has and that Ruth finds every single time she notices it. Quietly, helplessly endearing. Tommy is already down for the night, worn out from an afternoon of running with the neighbor boys in the last of the warm light before the season turns fully toward cold. Walter's in the front room with the radio turned low, some dance band playing from a station in the city, faint and a little crackling, but unmistakably wonderfully there in his own front room on his own evening, in a way that would have seemed close to magic to either of them only a few years earlier. And Ruth, for a few minutes, has nothing that needs doing. This is rare enough still in her life that when it happens she has learned to notice it, to actually inhabit the small window of stillness rather than immediately filling it with the next task on an endless list. She stands for a moment at the kitchen window, the same window she cleaned with vinegar water on that April morning we started, with the same faint cloudiness still there in the bottom corner, near where a small hand pressed against it 2 winters before that, and looks out at a garden gone quiet with the season, the last of the tomato vines pulled and composted, the ground turned and waiting for whatever comes next. I want to tell you what she's thinking in this quiet window of an evening. Though I want to be honest that I'm reconstructing this from the general emotional truth of women like her rather than from any single documented account. This is the composite nature of Ruth again, built from research rather than from one specific diary entry. But I think it's something close to this, a kind of tired, settled satisfaction that has very little drama in it, and is for exactly that reason hard to name, and harder still to have anyone else recognize. The coat is in the front closet, worn now through its first real season, exactly as warm and exactly as well cut as she had hoped it would be across the 18 months of patient wanting. The washing machine sits paid off entirely, its debt finally, quietly retired the previous spring, a machine that is now simply, completely hers. The radio plays in the next room, a small ongoing pleasure that arrived because she made it possible at a price and on a timeline her ledger could actually bear. The children are fed, schooled, growing. The 5 hard months of the previous winter are behind them, weathered without a single visible crack. A private victory that lives nowhere except in her own memory and in the small, steady confidence it has left behind. The confidence of a person who has tested her own competence against real difficulty and found it sufficient. None of this, I want you to understand, will appear in any history book. None of it was counted in any official measure of the nation's economic output during these years. If you had asked anyone in Ruth's town, a neighbor, the grocer, even Walter himself, fond and grateful as he was, to describe what Ruth did, the honest answer in the vocabulary available to that era would have been something small and dismissive: she keeps house. 3 words, carrying inside them an entire, extraordinary architecture of skilled labor, professional-grade financial management, textile expertise, nutritional planning, crisis leadership, and sustained emotional discipline that we have spent this whole evening trying to properly see. I want to be careful one last time not to resolve this into something too tidy. Ruth was not secretly miserable beneath a placid surface, waiting for a later century to arrive and finally recognize her. That framing misses her, I think, as thoroughly as the dismissive one does. She was by any honest measure a genuinely competent, genuinely fulfilled woman living a real and reasonably good life within the actual constraints available to her in 1925. Constraints she did not choose, could not fully escape, and had nonetheless learned to navigate with a skill that deserves even 100 years later to be called exactly what it was. Both of these things are true at once, the way they have been true all evening. The constraint was real and unjust in its quiet, structural way, built into the very architecture of how her labor was valued and named. And the life inside that constraint was also genuinely hers, full of real pride, real pleasure, real mastery, real love, conducted at a kitchen table with a 5-cent notebook that nobody but her would ever fully understand the true weight of. The lamp in the front room goes out first, Walter turning the radio off with a small click and stretching, telling Ruth he's for bed. Francis's schoolwork is finished and checked her lamp extinguished a few minutes later, the particular creak of the stairs marking her progress up to the room she shares still with Tommy. A sound Ruth has learned to read as precisely as she reads the gate at 6 o'clock each evening. The house one room at a time goes dark and quiet, the particular hush of a household settling fully into night. No radio now, no dishes, no schoolwork, only the small ordinary sounds of a house at rest. A settling board somewhere in the frame, the last tick of the stove cooling from dinner, the wind picking up very slightly outside. Moving through a garden that has given its last for the season and is simply patiently waiting. Ruth herself is last as she is most nights, checking the stove, checking the front door, allowing herself one final look at that kitchen window before she goes up. The window. The notebook shelved now in its drawer, until morning the whole small, precise architecture of another day, complete and closed, exactly as it was the day we first met her, exactly as it will be tomorrow, and the day after that, for years still to come. Here is what I find myself thinking about at the end of an evening like this one, and I want to leave it with you honestly without dressing it up into a lesson, because I don't think it's a lesson so much as it is simply something true. The work that history called nothing was always something. The women who were called ordinary were always in the particular and demanding architecture of their daily lives remarkable. Not in the grand singular way we usually reserve that word for, but in the accumulated daily, unwitnessed way that never made it into any official record, because the record simply wasn't built to see it. Ruth's marbled notebook does not survive in this story into any archive. No museum holds it, no historian will ever cite it. And yet the mind that filled its pages night after night for years, that mind was doing something genuinely skilled, genuinely difficult, genuinely worth an entire evening of careful attention 100 years later, from someone who never met her and never could. I think about the chain of hands this connects to, too, and I want to leave you with that image specifically, because I think it's the truest way to close. Ruth's own mother did this work before her with a different ledger and a different set of constraints in a kitchen. Ruth herself grew up watching from a child's height, exactly the way Frances now watches her mother from the kitchen table under the lamp. And somewhere in your own life, my friend, whatever decade you happen to be living in, tonight, whatever kind of room you're falling asleep in right now, I suspect there is some version of this same quiet, uncounted, essential labor happening close to you right now in this exact hour. Someone doing the invisible arithmetic that keeps a household's whole fragile architecture standing unremarked upon, unrecorded, and entirely real. If tonight has given you a little of what I hoped it would, somewhere quiet to land, something true to carry into sleep, I'd love it if you left a comment telling me where you were watching from and what hour it was when Ruth finally closed that kitchen window for the night. And tell me too what world you'd like to visit next, because the next evening I build is going to come from someone reading these words right now tonight. Leave your idea below. And if it's the one I choose, I'll read your name out loud at the very start of the next episode so you'll know when you hear it that it was yours. If this kind of evening is good company for you, a like and a subscribe help it find the next person lying awake, looking for exactly this, and I'd be genuinely grateful for both. Sleep now, my friend. Let the ledger close, let the notebook go back in its drawer until morning, and let your own mind go quiet the same way that kitchen went quiet, one small light at a time. There's nothing left tonight that needs your arithmetic. Rest well. Somewhere, if you could still see it, there'd be one last thing worth noticing before the dark takes it completely. A single lamp still burning in an upstairs window, small and gold against the deepening blue of an October night, the last one in the house, not yet gone out, holding for just a moment longer the whole quiet shape of everything we've spent this evening inside. And then, Chinley, that goes dark too.